Yep, there's and there go the empty screens. Okay, so let's get started with where we are. Again, John's going to be my co-host. So if you have any comments, if you want to chat your comment or just raise your hand or just start talking, whatever, you can unmute your own mic and join in. John's going to kind of help me keep an eye on that. So please feel free to make comments however way you choose to do that. We stopped last week in the middle of the book of Ezra. We've begun this return back to Jerusalem with the Jewish people being told by Cyrus it's okay to go back. It was God's will that they go back. That's why Cyrus did it. God even said that's what he would do. And they've begun to come back. They went back initially to do what? What was the original project for them to start on when they went back?
Rebuild the temple.
To rebuild the temple. That to me has always been kind of interesting, that it wasn't get back and rebuild the wall for protection and security. It was rebuild the temple because God goes first. And that seemed to be the point there, is get back, rebuild the temple. We saw last week they immediately got started and rebuilt the altar. And they laid the foundation for the temple. And then we saw there in Ezra chapter, I believe it's chapter 3, some of the mixed emotions. That there were some who wept, some who cheered with, some were overjoyed. There was seems to be some reaction of maybe this isn't what they expected. Maybe there's that sadness that this is what we could have had all along, and now we've kind of blown it. But we talked about, even with us in the church today, we ought to have some emotion. We need to have those times of joy. We need to have those times of sorrow, and their example of overwhelming emotion. That we tend to kind of shy away from emotion, but I think that was one of our lessons we looked at, is that we need to be willing to share our emotions. Then we saw the lessons we took from saw the people return to God's word, that they decided that let's do this as it is written in the law. But then we saw they kind of disappeared for a while. There was this lack of effort for several years. And then along come Haggai and Zechariah and tell them, it's time that you've built your houses, you've laid up, you've made the situation good for you. Now it's time to get back to work doing what God asked you to do. And this is where we are with the timeline with all of this. I don't know how well you can read that, but this is really the area we're looking at right now, where Haggai and Zechariah are back, are prophesying to the people, reminding them that it's time to get to work. And then by the end of Ezra chapter 6, the temple is rebuilt. There's that reminder of in the middle of chapter 4 there, where there's those references to their future persecution, the harassment that they were going to face. We talked about that too, that even for us today, that we ought to expect some harassment once in a while as Christians. That's part of what we're supposed to deal with. But this is our focus where we are right now. If you see at the bottom of that screen is the time for Esther to come in. And that's where we're going to look for the most part to see. We might jump back into Ezra a little bit. But this is the time of the book of Esther. If you want to turn over there in your Bibles, you might mark the book of Ezra. We might get back to there, but we're going to spend most of our time in Ezra. In Esther. We're not going to go into a great deal of detail, but we cannot overlook this book. Like I said, chronologically, it goes right here in between chapter 6 and 7. And this is where we are. This is the Persian Empire. This is the city, Susa. Shushan is what it says in some translations. This is the winter fortress, the winter palace of the Persian Empire. So you see kind of where it is related to Jerusalem, where it is related to the other places that they have been. But as we look at this book, let's look at some of these key characters, the main people that are involved here. The the primary characters, first of all, of course, is the king. This is Ahasuerus, the king. It's Xerxes the first, not Artaxerxes, but Xerxes. And again, he is in Susa at his winter palace, is where we're located right now. Oh, wait a minute. Before I go there, let me just kind of give you a brief outline of the book before we look at these characters. I got lost in my own notes here. The first two chapters, what we're going to see is, and this kind of works right here, is this is where Esther becomes the queen. She takes over, if you will, takes over being queen from Vashti. There's this 180-day festival that Xerxes is holding, basically just showing off his wealth, talking about his power. There's this great festival going on, and Vashti refuses to appear, and there's all kinds of drama around all that, but he just decides, okay, I'm going to make Esther my queen. That's in chapters 1 and 2. Chapters 3 through 5, this man named Haman rises to power, and he's very, you can tell by a lot of the text, he's a very egotistical guy. He in his rise to power, he wants people to show him respect. And Mordecai, this man who we find out is Esther's cousin, Mordecai won't bow to him. That makes him angry, and he decides he wants Mordecai killed, and by the way, all the Jews killed. That's what we see in chapters 3 through 5. Chapters 4 through 7 is Esther being encouraged by Mordecai to approach the king, plead for the lives of the Jews, for Mordecai's life and for the Jews, to the king. And as a result of this, Haman is killed. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail here in a minute. And then chapters 8 through 10 are basically the victories of the Jews. Pretty amazing, kind of a wild scene there for the last section of the book. But now let's carry on with these main characters. One of the main things, I don't have this as a main character, but one of the main things that we see as a result of this book is the Jewish festival of Purim. This is the probable origins of that Jewish festival. It's not one of the festivals in the law, but it is a festival that we see that the Jews continue to honor for centuries up until today even. So again, we have the characters. Again, the king, Ahasuerus, Xerxes, Esther, and then Esther and Mordecai. Now, let me stop here again for just a second too. Usually, and for the most part, we look at Esther and Mordecai as, if you will, the heroes of this book. And obviously, they're the main focus. Mordecai saves the king, then is severely persecuted, literally to the point of near death. And Esther comes to his rescue, rescues the Jews. But before we go down that route, let me just point out, this is kind of the bummer about the whole situation. Where should Esther and Mordecai be? Thought I had an answer for my house. They should have been in Jerusalem. They should have left. They were told by the king, they were told by God, it's time to go back to Jerusalem. I remember in our first lesson, we talked about some of the excuses. Why don't we just stay in Babylon? Let's stay in Babylon because it's easier here. We're comfortable here. We've built lives here. They're part of the group that chose to stay. They really shouldn't even be where they are. They are, the book technically, and like I said, this is kind of a damper on whatever your mental image may be of the book of Esther, but this book is technically about unfaithful Jews. This is a book about people who chose to not go back to their homeland, to stay in the comforts of Babylon. The focus is on those who chose to stay. It tells us a little bit about the fact that choosing to not obey God, you can find yourself outside of God's protection. You can find yourself outside of God's promise. God's promise was I was going to give you Jerusalem back. God's promise was I would return you from this captivity. These people chose to stay and found themselves in a very, very difficult situation. Now, they are delivered, but they're not delivered because of the greatness and the wisdom and the whatever of Esther and Mordecai. They're delivered because of God's grace and because God had a plan. They're delivered because of God's patience. They're delivered because God chose to save them. These people should have been part of the group going back in the first place. But because they chose not to, they had a problem. This wicked guy named Haman becomes a huge enemy of all of the nation of Israel. And what's the problem? Well, the problem is he decides, because Mordecai won't honor him, he wants them all killed. We'll look at that in more detail in just a minute as well. The opposition is, of course, Haman, the one who devised the plot. He's the one who decides, convinces the king that all these people need to be wiped out. We'll look at his decree here in just a minute as well.
Hey, Clint, can I back up to your point where you're talking about these people should have gone back to Jerusalem? I was just looking for a little clarity on that. So it is pretty well accepted then that the order or the allowance to return home was provided to all the Jews then, was universal? Because I'm thinking, Ezra's not even back on the scene yet, right? Is that because, I guess that's going to be 60 years between Ezra 6 and 7 like we discussed last week. So
yeah.
Maybe Ezra's not even alive yet, and that this is more like his parents? Or...
Well, Ezra's about to be heading that way. And again, I don't know why Ezra, why they didn't all leave in the first place, we don't know. There were some who just chose to stay. Like I said, I'm not saying that all those who chose to stay, it seems as though had this all worked out in Esther, that Ezra would have been part of those who were killed. We'd have never had Ezra. We'd have never had Nehemiah. So, part of the issue with them not leaving when they were first told that they could leave is what we see happen in this book. That had the whole Jewish nation just said, let's all leave. Now, were some restricted? It could have possibly been that they were restricted. We don't know that for sure. But what we do know is that there were some who chose to stay, and there were some who found themselves in this situation that because they didn't stay or because they didn't leave, things almost got very, very dicey for them. Richard, go ahead.
Historically, if I recall right, I believe that only like maybe a third or maybe even a fourth of the Jews that had went into captivity came back or went back to the Promised Land, and a good majority of those probably never went back to the Promised Land because they were part of the Assyrian captivity in the first diaspora. And so Assyria, when they took a nation to captivity, which they took, the 10 tribes to the north into captivity, they dispersed them all over the world or all over their known kingdom where they had power anyway. And so those people probably melded into Assyrian society. And then as Babylon would conquer Nineveh or Assyria, they would absorb that all that they had conquered. And so it could be that by the time Babylon came on the scene for, I think it was probably 40 years that they're in captivity before the Babylonian captivity, they had probably already started to move away. And so very few of the Jews came back from captivity. And that's where you get the Jewish people becoming a different kind of people. Instead of being nomadic and being herdsmen and things of that nature, they become more urbanized and become merchants and storekeepers. And some people think that's how the Jewish people became a lot like they are even to the present day.
Yeah, they were definitely, from the time that the northern kingdom went into captivity, from, all through those captivities, the people, acclimated to culture. A great deal of them just got absorbed into whether the Assyrian or the Babylonian cultures. And like I said, there were those who obviously just decided, I'm born and raised in Babylon. Well, in fact, Mordecai's name is a Babylonian name. It's the root of it is Marduk, one of the Babylonian gods. So he's he's probably a native. So it's easy for me to say, wow, they should have just packed up and left like they were supposed to. But you do have to kind of cut them some slack that, I mean, this is where they're born. I mean, this is where they've lived their whole lives. I mean, it's kind of like in our family, you know, Kara and I are both Oklahomans, you know, born and raised in Oklahoma. Our kids consider themselves Idahoans. I mean, they've been here since they were 8 and 5 years old. I mean, this is their life. They don't remember Oklahoma hardly at all. So these did I just compare Oklahoma to Babylon or Idaho? what just happened right there? But yeah, there were some who for whatever reason, maybe I should have said it that way, chose to not go back to Jerusalem, but they find themselves in this situation. So let's kind of overview we'll just kind of scan through the whole story real quick, but let's talk about some of the key features of the book of Esther. What is the most prominent characteristic? When you think of the book of Esther, what's the thing that first comes to mind about the book of Esther? You're probably thinking yes, you're correct. The book that has the longest verse in the Bible in it is Esther. Esther chapter 8, verse 9. Longest verse in the Bible. That's probably not what you were thinking. What you're probably thinking is that it's the one book of the Bible or a book of the Bible that doesn't mention the name of God. And that is absolutely true. The Song of Solomon also doesn't really mention the name of God. But God's name isn't anywhere to be found in the book, but his hand certainly is. God's fingerprints are all over this book. I mean, even in that whole situation with Mordecai, we see Mordecai not willing to bow down, and even in Haman's decree, he mentions the fact he doesn't bow down because he's a Jew. There seems to be that indication that because he's a Jew means he's not going to honor anybody above his God. He's not going to bow to anybody else. But no name, no mention of God's name. And we have to wonder why that is. And I think, kind of going back to what Richard said, kind of like John's question, there are some reasons that God's name might not show up in this. They're in a kingdom of a great king, an empire. You think back to that slide I showed at the beginning. This slide goes from what would be India to North Africa. I mean, it's a huge, vast empire. There's a few Jews left. And again, it may be that a lot of the Jews left don't even remember their Jewish culture all that well. So why is there no mention of the name of Jehovah? Maybe there is the question of where is he? You know, where is he in all this? Where's the, you know, I remember my grandparents used to talk about Jehovah God, but he was supposed to take care of everything. Now, here we are in Babylon. We've been here forever. So, I mean, it may be just that they're that far distant from their Jewish heritage that the author, who may in fact be Mordecai, some say it may be Nehemiah, but it may not be that prevalent to them, which is sad in and of itself. But what we do see is obviously we see God at work. Things are not great for the Jews where they are right now. Their situation isn't great, but God's at work. This book definitely shows God's providence. Sometimes God works behind the scenes. God still does that. If you look over at Ephesians chapter 1, when we think about God at work in the book of Esther, again, there's no statement God says God did this, God did that. But we know God is providentially working in the lives of these people. Paul writes about this hundreds of years later. In Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11, he says, "In him we also have received an inheritance because we were predestined according to the plan." There's our predestination. It's the plan. Predestined according to the plan of the one who works out everything in agreement with the purpose of his will. So we know for a fact it was God's will that they end up in Babylon, because God talks about Cyrus being the one to send them back. So they didn't realize how much God was all over this, but God knew how much he was involved in all of this. God is in control even in this situation, even without direct reference to him, even without seemingly seeing a great deal of honoring for God. God's still in control. That's a great reminder. We'll talk about some specific lessons in a minute, but that's a great reminder for us right now when we look at our culture. Our culture doesn't nod to God at all, but God's still in control. Our culture doesn't put God in his proper place, but he's still in control. But, the fact is, who else isn't mentioned in the book of Esther? Now, there's Ephesians 1:11. Who else isn't mentioned, though? Satan's not mentioned. There's no mention of Satan in this book, but he's obviously at work, too. He's using Haman to almost wipe out the Jewish people. And you connect that with Ephesians. That's why Paul closes out Ephesians in chapter 6, verse 11, or chapter 6, verse 12, telling us that we put on the full armor of God. Our battle isn't against flesh and blood. It's against Satan and his devices and against his wiles, as some translations say. Satan is at work in this book just as much as God is. Now, Satan's tool in all this is, of course, Haman. Look back in the book of Esther. Look at Esther chapter 3, just this is past the time where Esther has taken the place of the queen. Vashti is gone. Mordecai has been elevated in prominence, and he's being paraded through the town. And look at chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. Mordecai didn't bow to him. He's enraged, and here's this decree that he sends out. The royal scribes, verse 12, Esther chapter 3, the royal scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and the order was written exactly as Haman commanded it. It was intended for the royal satraps, the governors of each of the provinces, and the officials of each ethnic group, and written for each province in its own script and to each ethnic group in its own language. That kind of goes back to what Richard was saying. The empire kept everybody kind of allowed everybody to keep their cultural language, their cultural norms, if you will. So this decree is written to everybody in a way that they'll understand it their way. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the royal signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to each of the royal provinces telling the officials to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jewish people, young and old, women and children, and plunder their possessions on a single day, the 13th day of Adar, the 12th month. So we see Satan is obviously at work. That using Haman, this is his move. This is one of those moves to eliminate the Jews. This would solve so much for Satan. So this is bad news for the Jewish people. This could be it for them. So Mordecai in chapter 4 to thwart Satan's plan, even whether he knew it or not. In chapter 4, he appeals to Esther. We'll come back to that in a minute. But we see God is at work. And this is so interesting. To me, it's very subtle. But look at chapter 6, because we see God at work in a very subtle way here. Chapter 6, verse 1. That night, sleep escaped the king. God's at work in such detail. There's some of the older translations, some other, the Vulgate translations even say the Lord kept sleep from the king. God's at work in such a way that because the king isn't sleeping, here's what happens. Let's look at the rest of this verse. So he ordered the book recording daily events to be brought and read to the king. Now, I think that's kind of funny. What's he saying? He's saying, bring me the daily record, because if I can't sleep, bring me something so boring that this will put me to sleep. And he says, bring it to me, let me read it. They found the written report, and this goes back, this is a reference back to the end of chapter 2, and in chapter 3, the end of chapter 2, they found a written report of how Mordecai had informed on Bigthana and Teresh. That's a couple of great names right there, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the entrance when they planned to assassinate King Ahasuerus. That, again, end of chapter 2, they were mad at the king about something, they wanted him killed. The king inquired, what honor and special recognition have been given to Mordecai for this act? The king's personal attendants replied, nothing has been done for him. So the king can't sleep, asks for the record to be brought to him, reads through it and goes, hey, did we ever do anything for that guy Mordecai? Now, to summarize the rest of this chapter, what happens is he says, who's in charge of the court right now? They say, well, Haman's out there. They said, bring him in. So he asks Haman, he goes, if somebody did something really great for me, somebody was really super amazing, what would we do for him? And Mordecai says, well, he's got to be talking about me. And he says, well, here's what I'd do. I'd give the guy a special robe. I'd put him on a horse. I'd parade him around town, tell people how great he is, throw a feast for him. And Xerxes says, you know what? That's a great idea. Go get Mordecai. So Haman has to honor Mordecai himself. To me, that's so great. I mean, that's providence right there. That's just great. The guy who wanted the Jews killed didn't even think that Xerxes could be possibly thinking about anybody but him. But he says, go and get this guy and honor him. He honors him. Then fast forwarding a little bit further, they're at this feast and he tells Esther, sweet Esther, my wife, if I could give you anything, what would it be? And she says, I know who plotted this thing against us, and he should be punished. And so long story short, the gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai, he ends up being hung on himself. So because Esther called him out and says he's the one who did this, he's put to death and the Jews are saved. So now let's go back. Let's back up to this key verse. This is the verse that everybody knows about the book of Esther, Esther chapter 4. And let me just tell you this, maybe if you don't know this, this is very interesting. When Mordecai finds out about this decree, he goes out in the city square and he's mourning and weeping, and some of Esther's servants find him, and he says, here's what you got to do. Tell her what's going to happen, and tell her she's got to go ask the king to save us. Well, she's reluctant to do that because you don't just go knock on the king's door and go say, here, change the decree that you've sent out. So she's worried about this. But again, chapter 4, verse 13, here's Mordecai's answer. Mordecai told the messenger to reply to Esther, don't think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews because you are in the king's palace. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place, but you and your father's family will be destroyed. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. That's just a great verse. We yanked that verse out of context because the verse in and of itself is so powerful that maybe you've been put right here for this reason. And when he says that, I think he's right. I think he is echoing unintentionally God's providence. He's saying, you're put here for a reason. You didn't know it. You don't know why, but you're put here to do something good. It's not luck that you're here. It's providence. This is God's hand at work. And then from here on out, she approaches the king. She tells him, here's what I want. He honors her wish. And then from chapter 8 on, the Jews are allowed to defend themselves. And in fact, they slaughter a lot of their enemies, the people who weren't treating them right. So that key verse, like I said, is really kind of the anchor of this, and it does show us very much God's providence at work in all this. So again, that's a very short summary of the book of Esther. But let's take a couple of lessons from this before we jump back into Ezra. God had a plan. I'm not going to pretend I understand how all this worked or why it worked out like this. Again, going back to the thing I said at the beginning, it seems to me that these people should have been, as soon as they said, let's go back to Jerusalem, that maybe the older people should have convinced the younger people, hey, this is what we need, this is where we need to go. It didn't work out that way. And then it gets very dark for the Jews. I mean, there's the guy who's second in command saying, I'm going to wipe out all of them. And it's going to happen. I mean, there's this decree sent out to all over the Persian provinces. But God had a plan. God was working. God was in complete control. And remember, during this whole time, back in Jerusalem, there's people who are needing God's protection. There's people who are dealing with distractions, dealing with harassment from the people around them. God's taking care of them. But to God, they're no less important than his people who are still in Babylon. So God had a plan through all of this. We have to accept that. I mean, this is one of those things that I'm sitting here staring at this on my screen. This speaks to me. I mean, like in life right now, so much is suspended, so much is upended, so much is not how we are used to it being. God has a plan. God's going to work this out in some way. I don't see the end. I don't know how this will end. I never saw this coming. None of us did. But God has a plan. Is our situation this much near as dire as the Jews was? I don't believe so. But still, it's our issue, and God has a plan for it. But what we also see is the second lesson I want us to look at with this is what we see Esther do. The sacrifice of our own needs, maybe it should have been our own comfort, for the good of others. Again, to be real, for her to go to the king and just, I mean, there's no way she can just borrow. I mean, it says in the text that unless you're invited into his council, you don't just walk in and say, hey, you need to change that decree you made. That's just not how it works. It just, I mean, that's just not the way it goes. But she put aside that, and she put aside the potential for really bad consequences and said, I've got to do this. I've got to be the one to step up to take care of my people. Now, again, she was also providentially, I believe, given a great opportunity where she had the chance to go in and make this plea for her people. But she put aside her own comfort because it was for the good of other people. Now, there are so many applications that we can make with that. I'm going to touch a hot button here, I know, but I think it applies. We talk about masks. I mean, these masks that we're asked to wear, there are people who don't like them. There are some people who just hate them. There are some people who don't think they're worthwhile. Some people who don't think they do any good. But there are some people who do think they do good. There are some people who feel much better if you're wearing them. So sometimes you say, okay, I'll wear one for the sake of other people because it makes people feel good. It does some good. It might do some good, whatever. But it does make other people feel better, even if we're all wrong. So we set aside that for the good of others. And again, the flip side of that is, if you're someone who's very devoted to masks and you're out walking in the park and you see somebody 100 yards away not wearing one, you don't go run up to them and get in their face and chew them out for not wearing a mask. That's not to their own good. I mean, like I said, that's just a contemporary application for us right now. But there are so many other ways we can give of our time, sacrifice our time to help other people. We can sacrifice our money. We can sacrifice financially to help others. But sometimes God might put us in a position to help other people in a way that we don't understand, or for a reason we don't understand. We might not realize, or we might not know, why did I end up in this job? Why did I end up in this whatever? And God says, pay attention, look around and see what you can do to sacrifice maybe your own needs, your own comfort, your own time, and do something for other people. Sometimes those openings are beyond our immediate vision. We have to look a little bit further than that. And it might be uncomfortable. I'm sure it was uncomfortable for Esther to step in there and say, here's what we need to do. Here's what I want. But because she did, because she was willing to take that step, she fulfilled her part of God's great, big, larger plan. Anybody have any thoughts on any of this? Any comments before we jump back to Ezra? Okay. Well, like I said, that's a very brief overview of Esther. And like I said, I've taught this before without looking at Esther, but I think you just have to put it here. I mean, you have to deal with it right here because, again, this is kind of the interlude with people who are still in Babylon. While all this is going on, there's still something going on out or back in Babylon. Anything else? Nobody?
I've got another thing. Sorry, I don't mean to be like a mic hog here.
Go ahead.
One of the interesting things as well, I used to work with Israelis a lot for several years, and Purim, the holiday associated with this book, is kind of like their Halloween. They dress up in disguises. And I think so I was just kind of searching out, like, why is that? And there's a number of different reasons behind that. But I think part of it is also like just one of the things I was reading here is that kind of, again, like we were talking about how God and Satan aren't explicitly mentioned in the books. In some ways, they're kind of masked. Just that idea of wearing masks still kind of applies. Yeah. It's an interesting idea.
That is. That's very interesting. Yeah.
Clint?
Yes.
This is Carolyn Mack, and I have a question for you.
Yes, ma'am.
Would you tell me, Esther has been made queen, Xerxes' queen, but is she married to him? Is she on an even level with him, or is she just a figurehead?
Well, she, I don't exactly, just to be real honest.
Okay. Well, the reason for my question is because I was wondering why it was difficult for her to go and visit with the king. And she was so hopeful that he would give her that scepter so that she would know that it was okay for her to say something. And I just wonder, is that just societal in that time, or what is her relationship to him?
Yeah, what I was going to say is that looking at chapter 2, it says that in chapter 2, verse 17, he loved her more than the other women. She won favor and approval. He put the crown on her head and made her queen in place of Vashti, held a great banquet for her and all this.
Okay.
But in those cultures, the king, I mean, you can see how he just dismissed Vashti. He says, "Okay, you're not queen anymore. You're done." The queen was not considered a co-regent by any means. I mean, it isn't like you would see like I guess I immediately think of English kings and queens that, the queen has a say, the king is kind of her partner, if you will, or the king and queen kind of. And I guess really you could even go back to English history where various kings made all kinds of decisions about their queens. I mean, sometimes it involved them losing their heads and things that.
True.
There was some absolute rule there. But yeah,
okay.
I don't know that whether he actually married her or not, but I think regardless, he still had absolute authority.
I see. Okay, that's my main point, I guess. Thank you.
Yep. There was one comment that says that God is always at work, and that's absolutely true. That I think is kind of the message of this book. Somebody raised a hand.
That was me, Clint.
Oh yeah.
Queens back in that day had no more authority than a king would allow them to have.
Yeah, exactly.
So they're in many ways arm pieces of the king to show off his glory or to show off his power or his authority. And that's how kings and queens were almost all down through history, almost all the way till Henry VIII. And that all changed with Henry VIII. And Elizabeth ends up becoming a queen only because Henry VIII could not produce a son or a male child. And that's when king and queen stuff started changing, and queens came into having power. But up to that time, they had no power. Other than what the king allowed them to have, or authority that he allowed them to have. I don't know if that helped or not, but there you are.
And yet she did have quite a bit of power with her people.
Yeah, she had some influence for sure.
Yeah.
Wendell?
Yeah, the cool thing or the neat thing about this story is that Esther was there at the right time, and Mordecai even told her about that. So who knows, perhaps you were here, God has put you here for this moment. And indeed, while she might not have had the power that we recognize, she had such influence on this man who admired her in such a way that he was willing to give half his kingdom to her. She was able to, the power of her beauty, the power of her love for her people, and just the way she carried herself during this time frame. She had power over this man to change something that was unjust and deadly to the Jews.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, she whether she had the however you'd say the provincial authority, she definitely had some influence. I mean, she obviously had done what she needed to do as a queen correctly for her to have that kind of influence. But again, thinking about that culture and how the king had absolute power, the king has made a decree. You don't change those. But again, we see God's hand in all of this. We see God working through all these various situations.
Hey, Clint.
Yeah.
It's Dana here.
Yes.
Going on that theme of what you just said, I find it interesting that you wonder how much of God's providence is work here when they do go to the item of him making a decree that can't be changed. So he didn't change it. He just told the Jews that they could defend themselves.
Yeah.
So that, it had to be that way because of the decree, but you also wonder, is God telling the Jews, you're going to have to get out there and do some work yourselves?
Yeah.
You're going to have,
Yeah, that's true. He didn't tear the decree up or anything. He said, if people come after you, you can defend yourselves. And like I said, if you want to read through chapters 8 through 10, they definitely defend themselves. All right. There's another comment said, I've always seen a parallel between Joseph and Esther as being part of God's plan, being in the right place at the right time. That's kind of the same situation that, Joseph tells his brothers, you had it in mind for evil, but God had it in mind for good. I mean, that's how it works out with Esther. Well, before we jump back into Ezra, we're not going to get back into this. Well, I'll wrap it up here in just a minute. Let me ask you though, how many of you were alive in 1940? I can't see your hands. Can't everybody raise their hand all at the same time? But there were, I'm sure there were a few of you alive in 1940. Just some things about Roland and Barton raised their hand. Like I said, I'm sure there's a few of you. There are some things that happened in 1940. Pinocchio made its debut in 1940. Tom and Jerry debuted in 1940. Woody Woodpecker and Elmer Fudd, all those debuted in 1940. Batman's sidekick, Robin, first shows up in 1940. The Jeep was invented in 1940. Other things, Booker T. Washington was the first African-American honored on a U.S. postage stamp in 1940. The Battle of France began. The Dunkirk evacuation in 1940. Paris was bombed for the first time. The occupation of Normandy in 1940. Roosevelt wins his third term. This is the year, 1940s year, Anne Frank goes into hiding. The first computer was made in 1940. 1940 was 80 years ago. When we jump back into Ezra in chapter 7, we're 80 years after they have made the initial return back to Jerusalem. From 583 to 483, 485, somewhere about that. 80 years. 50 years since they began working on the temple. So there are 50 years since the temple has been built. Look at chapter 7. We'll just read this and then we'll call it for the night. Ezra chapter 7. Let's look at verses 6, the first few verses of the people who come back. Start in verse 6. These are the people that came up from Babylon. And Ezra's who we're talking about here at the end. He was a scribe, skilled in the law of Moses, which the Lord, the God of Israel, had given. The king had granted him everything he requested because the hand of the Lord his God was on him. Some of the Israelites, priests, Levites, singers, gatekeepers, and temple servants accompanied him to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. Ezra came to Jerusalem in the 5th month during the 7th year of the king. He began the journey from Babylon on the 1st day of the 1st month and arrived in Jerusalem on the 1st day of the 5th month, since the gracious hand of his God was on him. Now, Ezra had determined in his heart to study the law of the Lord, obey it, and teach its statutes and ordinances in Israel. Ezra shows up in about 458, that's the year, 458 BC, after 80 years after Zerubbabel had first brought the people back. So it's easy to look at these two accounts, Ezra and Nehemiah, together, to look at Ezra even as a book and not grasp that. But we're looking at a long time. So our focus next week will shift back to Ezra. We're going to look at some of the details about who Ezra is before we look at the actual work that he's involved with. Ezra as a man is very impressive. From here on out, we will look more specifically at Ezra and Nehemiah as individuals and how their character, their personalities really affected the work. So I'm going to stop this screen share. I'm going to stop the recording. Any other comments before we stop the recording? And then I'll let y'all just talk for a minute if you want to. Any other comments on class, questions, anything?